As a Nashville native, Beverly Watts was appointed the executive director of the Tennessee Human Rights Commission in July 2007. She has more than 30 years' experience in civil rights enforcement and education in the public and private sector. She has made presentations to numerous organizations on civil rights, diversity, and leadership at the national and international levels. Beverly is a past president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, or as the acronym IAOHRA, and I don't know how to pronounce that in any catchy way. IORA. Thanks, Beverly. Where she represented IORA throughout the United States, Canada, and the United Nations World Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa. She currently serves as the IORA South Region Representative and Annual Conference Planning Chair. She has served as Chair of Women Executives in State Government and currently serves as the Mission Advisor to the Cable Board and on the board of the YWCA of Middle Tennessee, and is a life member of the NAACP. And you can read more about Ms. Watts in your conference program. Please help me welcome Ms. Beverly Watts.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
All right, that's good. Sound like those third graders I used to teach. Before I start, I really want to take a moment to remember someone else who made their transition this year, and that person is Fred Cloud. Many of us would know that Fred would be sitting down front, and about this time, either he would be on the stage or he would come up and take a microphone. And if you always remember Fred, he'd have a lot of papers, because he would have written out what he needed to say. Now, his message was always consistent. He was always challenging us to keep moving toward the prize. He probably didn't use that language, but when he finished, that's the short version of what Fred had said to us. The long version always chastised us to know what we were doing and to do it well. I've known Fred for more than 20 years. I am a Nashville native, but I sort of left here for a while, wandered around, and it was in that wandering that I met Fred Cloud. I did not know Fred when I lived here. And Fred and I met at an IORA conference. Or was it a NAIRA conference? See, that was the one that would get you, which is the National Association of Human Rights Workers. Fred was the editor of the Journal on Intergroup Relations. Fred was a journalist and a prolific writer. If you ever have a chance, all you need to do is read his writings. It is a roadmap to what we need to do in affordable and fair housing for this country. Fred was a national figure as well. It was through this that Fred worked with others around the country running state and local fair housing agencies, and who worked with HUD officials and others, working on the whole notion of policy and policy development. Without Fred Cloud, I believe, and Fred's not one of those people whose name is always up in the bright lights, but it's the Fred Clouds of the world who've helped to shape the landscape, the policy, and the initiatives that we work on today. Fred is also was one of those persons who, if you talked to him for more than 15 minutes, he was quiet, but he was direct. And he was always making inroads into the things that made sense. Fred advocated for the development and the creation of the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. And we put that in our history when we had our 50th anniversary. Not a lot of people knew that. Fred was all over this state working with folks. You might know George Barrett's name because he was an attorney and a civil rights advocate. Well, he was one of Fred's partners. And Fred was always whispering in George's ear, because George said that one day, well, you know, Fred and I, we're losing giants in this community, giants who've had national impact. Fred was my mentor. He was a wise sage, but he was a warrior, and that is something I will always remember. He wasn't always out here throwing spears the way we think, but he was throwing spears the way it matters, setting policy, talking to mayors, talking to governors, talking to legislators to get them to move us from off of where we were. sometimes this work that we do can be somewhat desolate and barren. Thank you, Fred, for putting trees and flowers on the desert, because I think that's what you did. He was clear and cogent whenever he spoke. Well, Fred was the editor, I said. He was the writer. I was the managing editor for a while of the Journal on Intergroup Relations. So at one point, Fred and I must have talked every day, and especially when the journal was coming out, because my office was in Louisville, Kentucky, where I served as the director of the Kentucky Human Rights Commission. And so we would go and pick up the books and mail them out. Well, he would call, talk with me, and then I'd turn him over to the person who was really doing it. That was my assistant, Linda. But Fred, we would always talk. But then we'd get around to the notion of who can we get to write other stories. Because it wasn't just about Fred writing. He always wanted others to do that as well. So if you had a conversation with Fred at any meeting and you talked to him long enough about it, he'd say, you need to write an article about that. And that was the way Fred worked. Now, he would always write articles, but he would do that. Well, his voice will be missed, but more importantly, his actions will be missed. It is my hope that his challenge to us on the mornings that he came here when he served as the chair of this council and throughout his life, that we continue to hear that we continue to read those challenges, and that we continue to move forward. We must use Fred's writing as a barometer in the quest for fair and affordable housing for all. I think there are probably two quotes that I found that I think epitomizes Fred. It says, courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is a quiet voice in the night saying, I'll try again tomorrow. That was Golda Meir. Again, he wasn't loud, but he was bold, and he was direct. And the second is, never believe that a few caring people cannot change the world, for indeed they are the only ones who ever have, and that is Eleanor Roosevelt. I want to just thank Fred for doing what he did, for serving on the Metro Human Relations Council as its director, for being the chair of this council, for making a difference far beyond what we all know. Thank you, Fred. You were and are a true giant. Well, as I sort of transition, because I thought it was important, and Tracy and I talked to really acknowledge Fred today. But I think the other part of it was then there was this challenge. Well, what would Fred have you want to say today? So that was really the big challenge. So we're going to talk a little bit about a few things, and if there's any time, we'll take a few questions if that's something we need to do. But at the Tennessee Human Rights Commission, we're pleased to be here today and for our continuing partnership with HEAT. We were in Knoxville last week with ECHO, and we're in Memphis next week with the West Tennessee Fair Housing Group doing that. We don't have an acronym yet, you all. We're trying to figure out who we are in West Tennessee. But we do have a dynamic group. But we're always looking for partners to work with and to promote a better understanding of fair housing throughout this community, and how better to do it than with those who are doing it on a day-to-day basis. I'd like to introduce you to our new housing manager, Sadia Williams. Sadia. Many of you might know Richard Gadzetpo. Well, Richard is a minister. So Richard's in an election process to become the bishop for Africa for the AME Church. We didn't want Richard to go, but Richard said he had a higher calling. So we said, okay, we'll give you that. And for many of you who had training, Richard is a great trainer. So is Sadia. We look forward to having you get to know Sadia and work with her. Sadia has been in our office 5 years. She's a great investigator. We just promoted her, so we look forward to working with her and having you work with her, because she, too, is a great employee. And we also just want to acknowledge Richard for all of his work, because he did great work while he was with us. Well, we're responsible for safeguarding individuals from discrimination in employment, public accommodations, and housing, and we also enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 at the state level. And those are a few words and big responsibilities. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about housing, but every once in a while all these things sort of flow, because I do want us to connect these dots. Housing is not a siloed activity from everything else we do in life. It is one of the most important activities. And we want to talk a little bit about what we know about the landscape across Tennessee and what we're seeing And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the things as we deal with this affirmatively furthering fair housing that takes me back a while. But before I start, I want to tell you a story about a person who was on a bus. And the day was April the 4th, 1968. The person was leaving Tennessee State University. And what they saw out the window was tankers and National Guard persons coming onto that campus. Well, there were no cell phones in 1968. You know, they had those phones on the corner that you had to put the dime in. You remember? Some of you might. There was nothing on the bus. There were portable radios, but you never could get service on the buses, if any of you all remember that time period. As the bus rolled out, it got into downtown Nashville. Person got off and got on a bus and went to Old Hickory. Well, that person was me. By the time I got home, my father was in the yard pacing back and forth. I, at that time, I think was 68. I was a junior at TSU. And what he told me was, they killed Dr. King. They killed Dr. King. Now, my father was the kind of person, had a sixth grade education, but he was always reading, he was always doing things, he was always concerned about the movement. We would sit at the dinner table and he would talk about, you know, that Kelly Miller Smith is a wonderful man, and that's the Reverend Dr. Kelly Miller Smith, the pastor, the senior, the pastor of First Baptist Capitol Hill, who helped to lead the movement here. He'd talk about the students and everything else. This was before I got to Tennessee State in the middle 60s. But he always said, I think King is going to take us to victory. I think we're going to make it. My grandfather was a Baptist preacher, so every once in a while I sometimes forget that I'm not, so y'all might have to pull me off. But that is really where I learned how to speak to people, was in the church. And it was in the church that I learned about the civil rights movement and other things. Well, this story on that day, what did we do? We went to church that night. We went to church that night. And it was an interesting kind of a piece. But for the next 7 days, and this was before CNN and 24-hour news, it was news all the time. Huntley, Brinkley, and everybody's talking about the death of Dr. King. Well, I was in Memphis this week for the April 4th Foundation. Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Reverend Dr. Bernard Lafayette both were there at the foundation dinner. And Memphis has a holiday. And then there was a celebration at the National Civil Rights Museum. And everyone was remembering what happened that day. And Reverend Jackson was standing next to Dr. King. One of the things they both said on Monday night, which I think is quite interesting, is that Dr. King laid the foundation for the passage of the act long before April 4th. President Johnson garnered the votes to get it passed in 5 days. This had been languishing in Congress. Understand, we got the Civil Rights Act, we got the Voting Rights Act, bam, bam. It was in Congress that long. Voting Rights Act, 50 years. So for about a year and a half, 2 years, housing was there. Dr. King was also working on the Poor People's Campaign at the time. And they linked the issues between the Poor People's Campaign and the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King said that it was time for people to have decent wages and economic stability in their lives. And that poverty was our biggest enemy. That African Americans were suffering, but so were whites and others. He had built a coalition of individuals from throughout this country to deal with that. And the centerpiece of all of that was housing. And the Fair Housing Act was just languishing. People didn't want those people in their neighborhood and other things. So we always have to remind ourselves that we're not here just because it's April. We're here because people fought, people died, people marshaled political resources to get us to this day. Bernard Lafayette also said something. He said people thought they killed Dr. King. They may have hit him, but they missed in terms of what the outcomes he wanted to have happen. He said they hit him, but they missed. But in essence, we won because we started on this journey. What happened in 1968, however, is one of those things that I call kind of that stop-start issue. Dr. King had a powerful moral voice that moved things along. We have had others, but none as powerful as his. So as a result, we watched policies come and go, or policies stall, or neighborhoods become what they were. We also saw places like Nashville, where Jefferson Street was a bustling commercial center, crawl to a halt. We saw housing deteriorate in certain neighborhoods where African Americans lived after the riots. Remember, there were riots. Nobody bothered to fix up anything. You can go to neighborhoods across this country. People were frustrated when Dr. King died. Now, while some people said they shouldn't have rioted, you might be right, but frustration comes out in different ways. And this moral voice that everyone had listened to about nonviolence was suddenly gone. Suddenly gone. So you wonder, what do we do? Well, at some point, affirmatively furthering takes us back to 1968, folks. I know people don't want to hear that, but it really does. It takes us back to policies of local government. It takes us back to issues in neighborhoods. It takes us back to failure to do things that we should have done then. The neighborhoods we have today are a direct result of what happened up to 1968. It got frozen in 1968 when many of the neighborhoods got burned down. So affirmatively furthering is not something we can look at. And I always want to bring this back home. This really is about people. Yes, it's an emotional topic, and it is an issue that we need to deal with. At some point, if you don't know you got a cold, you don't know what to take for it. So we need to determine we got a cold, a flu, or pneumonia, and let's find the medicine. And stop worrying about who, what, when, and where, and how it happened. So I think that's one thing. I think, too, that if we listen to those who were there with Dr. King and we look back at what was the Poor People's Campaign, again, the campaign demanded economic and human rights for poor Americans of diverse backgrounds. Dr. King presented a set of demands to Congress and executive agencies, and they set up a 3,000-person tent city on the Washington Mall. They stayed there for 6 weeks. It was motivated by a desire for economic justice, that all people should have what they need. The Poor People's Campaign was multiracial. It was African American, it was whites, it was Mexican Americans, many of whom were farm workers, Puerto Ricans, and Native Americans who were tribal individuals, aimed at alleviating poverty regardless of race. The Economic Bill of Rights of the Poor People's Campaign asked the federal government for $30 billion. This is 1968. When somebody gives me two figures and a B behind it today, I know we're not going to make it. Okay? 30 billion in 1968 was a lot of money. Today, what is it? It's not a lot of money when you talk about fixing something that's this old. A guaranteed annual income, and guess what else they asked for in 1968? More low-income housing. Not all in the same neighborhood, however, which is what we got. It was really the second phase of the civil rights movement, and after Dr. King's death, it really did stall. Dr. King says, "We believe the highest patriotism demands the ending of the war and the opening of a bloodless war to a final victory over racism and poverty." That is still something that we need to do. President Johnson, on signing this bill on April the 11th, said, "We just want to put our shoulders together and put a stop to both." He was referring to Dr. King's assassination and the looting and burning of the cities. He said, "The time is here. Action must be now." In the Civil Rights Act of 1968, America does not move forward, and the bell of freedom, America does move forward, and the bell of freedom rings out a little bit louder. We have come some of the way. We have come some of the way, not near all of it. There is much yet to do. President Johnson's words, "We have come some of the way, not near all of it. There is much yet to do," rings clear and rings loud today. We still have much work to be done. Much work to be done. HUD's theme this year, shared opportunity in every community, really rings clear around that particular quote. Shared opportunity in every community. Last year, when the Supreme Court said that disparate impact was, in fact, appropriate and fair housing. Now, disparate impact had been used in employment, education, and suddenly fair housing pops up, and they say, oh, no, got to court thanks to Texas. Texas does a lot for us in terms of the Supreme Court. I always remind people, I'm from Tennessee, but we're getting ready to do something too, I think. We'll see. And that's an editorial comment in case anybody wanted to know. But at some point, we're looking for shared opportunity in every community, but that's going to require us to do some things. And what I want to talk about is just a little bit. On yesterday, I watched the ceremony at 7th and D Southwest. And by the way, I worked for HUD for a while. I worked in the building. I also ran the National Fair Housing Training Academy, so I could see myself sitting there, and then I saw friends that I knew in the audience, so it was a fun thing. And it was always good to get to leave my desk and then go downstairs and get lunch and not have to catch a plane back to Nashville, so that was sort of good. But they talked about some things yesterday, and that's the structural issues and the structural barriers. And the keynote speaker talked about structural racism. It says structural racism, and any ism, is really history which lies underneath the surface, providing the foundation for anything that is a barrier to full participation of all in the country. It's about culture, which exists all around our everyday lives, and is the interconnected institutions and policies, the key relationships and rules of society, providing the legitimacy and reinforcement to maintain an ethnically divided society. If we want to look at how divided we are, all we need to do is look at any map in any city, USA. And we can define, for the most part, where people live, and it is based on race. When we look at those communities, we can also look at where they are economically. Somebody said to me, well, I was at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, they said data is your friend. Well, when data really tells you the truth, and you keep going, oh no, that's not the issue today, you are in denial. Dr. King says, all progress is precarious, and the solution of one problem brings us face to face with another problem. Sometimes it is the fear of these problems that keep us from moving forward. Well, I'm supposed to be talking about the state of the state. Well, let me get to the state of the state. Let me talk a little bit about Tennessee. We're 53 years old this year. We were created in 1963 by Governor Frank Clements, and we were basically a human relations, and we were the Human Relations Commission. Now, most people call me, they said, oh, you work for the Human Relations Commission. I said, no, I'm Human Rights. Mel is Human Relations. And basically, but our name changed, because we started out as the Tennessee Human Relations Commission, and our job simply was to advise the governor about race and race-related issues. In 1978, the Tennessee Human Rights Act was passed, and we became an enforcement agency. We had had a relationship with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that continued after we did that. We also changed our name. We've had 3 names. One was the Tennessee Human Relations Commission. The other was the Tennessee Office of Human Development, and then the Tennessee Human Rights Commission in 1978. One of the things that happens over years is you end up getting more authorities, but you never get more people or money. And so we've been like that all along as well. So we got more authority. We were doing employment and public accommodations initially. Then we started doing housing. Then we were doing the affirmative action for inside the state of Tennessee, and we were coordinating that. It's still in our law, but we don't do that anymore. That's the Department of Human Resources who does that internally. Then in 2009, we picked up Title VI enforcement, and we've had it once before under executive order. It went away and it came back. Title VI is the original Civil Rights Act and does prohibit discrimination in entities receiving federal financial assistance. That's every state and local government, any of their subrecipients. And so that is really where all the money comes in. Currently, the state of Tennessee operates at a level that is probably right at about 50% federal dollars. If we lose it, we go down. So that's one of the issues there. The other thing is we also became a HUD agency, and we have collaborative partnerships. I've been around since '07. I came back here having lived in Chicago, another very segregated city, also with a very high crime rate. I lived in Louisville, Kentucky, served there for about 12 years. An interesting city, also segregated, but not as large as the other. And I lived in Washington, D.C. for about 2 years. Inside the Beltway is an interesting place. They talk a different language over there. And so I decided that inside the Beltway was not great. My grandkids didn't live inside the Beltway, so I need to get back closer. They live in Kentucky, but it's still close enough. But the interesting piece is there's this notion that there's us inside the Beltway and then there's the rest of the people. I think it should be the other way around, because I think we do know what's best. And that policies sometimes created inside the Beltway give us angst outside the Beltway. One of those policies was created about 30 years ago. It had to do with felons living in public housing. I think that was a HUD rule, y'all. And every once in a while, I'm old enough to remember some of this stuff. I said, wait a minute, what is this? And now we have the issue. Well, just 3 days ago, they turned the corner. They made a U-turn. And the U-turn said, just on its face, because someone is a felon, you can't deny them housing, and we're going to enforce this under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So there's good news happening around the country. We're not doing it in Tennessee, but that doesn't mean anything. We can pass it along to the HUD folks, because that's what we need, is a real look and view at what policies don't make sense, and we need to change them, and that's one of them. A lot of people coming out of prison just want to do what? Come back, find a place to live, and get a job, both of which have been barriers for them. They've not been able to do that. There is a gentleman who, as a result of our study of the status of human rights in Tennessee, lives in Johnson City, Tennessee. He testified in Knoxville about issues related to former felons. I tell you this story because he is a former felon. He got out. He had done something as a youth. Indiscretions of youth are interesting. His was such that he got into trouble. He went to jail. He was in there for 5 to 10 years, I believe he said. But when he came out wanting to do the right thing. Couldn't find a job. He had family, so he had a place to stay in Johnson City. But there was no job. So there he is, not working, doing odd jobs, other kinds of things. He says, well, what can I do? He owns one of the largest car washes in the area now, and he hires former felons. He decided, because he had it, but not everybody has it, to do that. So he started his own business. But he talked about this whole ban the box issue at our conference and said, this doesn't make any sense. He said, we need to deal with people as they come to us, not based on who we think they are. Does that sound familiar to you all? No, not what they look like, or not their gender, or not anything else, or not who they love. But those are the kinds of things, so we have all of these plethora of issues. So he brought that to our attention. Well, there was ban the box legislation. I haven't checked today. I don't know where it is in the legislature. But at least it got out of committee, and it was moving. So that's good news, is there are people listening and dealing with this issue of ban the box. The housing issues are being looked at, and people are talking about, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should review whether or not they can, A, afford the housing, B, look like they're good tenants, make an effort to pay the bills, as opposed to always stigmatizing them for being in prison. So that's sort of good news. So we see those kinds of things happening. In the status of human rights in Tennessee, we looked at 14 issues. We have a report on our website that is at tn.gov/human rights. And we have a report. It's called The Status of Human Rights in Tennessee. We went to 4 cities. We were doing 5, but we didn't have enough people in Johnson City, but 3 of them traveled to Knoxville. We looked at issues in employment. We looked at issues in health care. We looked at domestic violence. We looked at homelessness. We looked at health care. We looked at a variety of subjects. But we also looked at housing. But housing showed up not just in the housing area, it showed up in almost every area. And we also looked at education. And in education, they talked about segregations in schools and those kinds of things, so it came up there as well. We have been a partner with HUD for more than 25 years. And through that, we have the authority to enforce federal fair housing laws as well as the Tennessee Human Rights Act. So we're always looking for how can we identify and do that. One of the things is in our report, we did a comparison over a 3-year period, and I think we looked at 2012 to 2014 to figure out what we knew. The numbers in housing never compare to the numbers in employment. Our agency gets about 800 plus complaints. 800, well, we get about 10,000 calls. Frank Guzman is in the back. I forgot Frank. Frank works on our staff too. Wave, Frank. If some of you call, you might talk to Frank. Frank is our all-about go-to guy, and he's in the community a lot. But we get about 10,000 calls every year. We synthesize those down. We end up filing somewhere around 300 to 400 employment cases. But in the housing arena, we get about 500 calls, but those synthesize down into about 200 complaints at our largest numbers. Now, what does that mean? I've always said that people always want to find a place to live and have a good place, good safe place to sleep. So sometimes they just keep moving. They move past an issue that they know is wrong because they're busy trying to get a place to live for them, their children, and their families. So they usually will do that. So what we noticed was we looked up, our numbers were right around 200, 250. HUD had less than 100 cases across Tennessee. So totally, we only have 300 plus cases that we're seeing. That's not a lot of cases. It is the most underreported issue in this country, housing and housing-related matters. There is something we need to do to help people understand, plus we need to know it because it will help us understand what we need to do to fix it and what we need to do to help persons out here who are landlords and others so that they don't make these kinds of mistakes. What we always try to do during this month is provide a lot of education for individuals who are in the realtor business, who are attorneys, who are others, so they understand the rules and can avoid it. This is a costly process. I'm not going to tell you it's not. In Kentucky, we costed out what it costs. We've not done that in Tennessee. And in one case, we told the landlord, well, since you took us to court, my attorneys, I pay them X. Your attorneys, you pay them Y. What we found out was they had real expensive attorneys. And when it was all said and done, they also owed the complaining party somewhere around $25,000, which we got for her. And they had to pay their attorneys too. And they paid their attorneys hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that was a housing case. And it was Paducah, Kentucky. And the young lady is a woman by the name of Regina Copper. See, they allow me to do this stuff when I was in Kentucky. I could call any name, anywhere, anytime, any place. I can't do that in Tennessee. We have everything confidential. I always like calling names and making that known. Regina was a young mother with a child, and they decided not to do that. Now, how did they pay it? They paid it using their homeowners insurance, which I found quite interesting. The insurance companies still do it today. They're a little bit stickier. And when we see attorneys operating for the responding party, a lot of them are attorneys for the insurance company in the housing arena, which is different from employment. In employment, they are representing the actual employers themselves. And they usually do charge quite a bit of money. You will also note the types of complaints we're seeing. Race is still 30% of all of the cases we see, both in employment, housing, and in public accommodations. And usually what I can tell you is if we see it in one area, meaning there are issues of high employment discrimination claims, we also see high housing discrimination claims. Nashville, Davidson County, and Knoxville are the places where we get the most complaints for two reasons. Number one, we've educated a lot of people in those communities so they know what to do and where to go. The other is there are issues. It doesn't mean there aren't issues in Memphis where we get the lowest number of cases, by the way. We personally get the lowest number of cases from Memphis, and that's interesting. It's just that they don't know, and penetrating and getting information out is important. We also like to make sure that realtors and others know what the issues are, and thanks to Tracy, and I saw Carol Gish and others, they're also out there doing a lot of education around what you have to do when you're building structures, and how you have to make them accessible, and how you have to make accommodations. It is this kind of information that we think is wonderful. Well, in the housing area in our report, what we found out was access to affordable and accessible housing was an issue defined by at least 20 people. By the way, we had 57 people to testify, and during this time period, let me see if I've got those numbers for you just to let you know, and then I'm going to give you the details. Every once in a while, I move pages around. And we were in 4 cities. We started out in Memphis, we went to Chattanooga, Knoxville, and then we ended up here in Nashville. And we also had individuals coming from across the country and other things. I can't find the numbers. It's in the summary of the report itself. The other was intimidation and harassment of female low-income residents was a big issue. We heard this in the housing arena. We heard this in the domestic violence arena, and in the whole notion of what happens to women when they try to have property, especially if they're single mothers, and how vulnerable they are to not only landlords but the workers who work for the landlords, repairing and those kind of things. And the issues of harassment and intimidation is up. The criminal background checks was another issue, as I talked to you about earlier, and that's being looked at. And then the whole notion of housing disparities. If I live in X neighborhood as opposed to Y neighborhood, what can I expect? What will it cost? And what happens when my neighborhood gets gentrified and I can no longer afford to live there? And those issues came up as well. The recommendations was that we develop initiatives, partnerships, and policy proposals to advance equity. We continue to work with partners throughout, whether they're government, whether they're private, whatever, so we can do this. Propose legislation requiring accessible units in developments for rural and urban areas. Develop and have residents attend eviction prevention classes quarterly. This came from a resident who had been the victim of who had been evicted numerous times, who just didn't know the rules. She said, look, let's train people and tell them what eviction looks like and what they're responsible for doing and get them knowledgeable about this, and we think that will do. Many of our cases that we see, it's eviction cases based on race, based on gender, and sometimes based on multiples, including disability. Address health-related maintenance issues within 24 to 48 hours. I'm sure all of you have heard about the issues in Memphis with respect to the development down there. It's a horrific issue, came out on the press. I know Norma doesn't want to talk about that. But anyway, but it's serious. But that's not the only place it occurs. There was fecal droppings from all kinds of rodents. There were roaches and other things. So, we don't live in Flint, Michigan, but we have issues of the same nature. And it might not be water, but it's housing. So we need to be aware of that. And I say, let me digress on the Flint thing. Water is always an issue. And if it's one river, it's another river. And all you have to have is an unfortunate leak or dumping or other things for us to be the next Flint. So we shouldn't think we're any better than Flint. We should be looking for ways to make sure we don't become Flint as it relates to water. As it relates to health-related maintenance issues, we need to make sure that our places are clean and that we do the right kinds of things to get rid of the critters, whoever the critters are. And then the other is fair housing education for city residents. The question is, who are the city residents? Everyone. And we need to let them know their rights and their responsibilities. The next area where we saw housing came up in disability rights areas. It said there needed to be issues related to travel, employment, housing. This came from speakers talking about disability issues. Education. Barriers to success for persons with disabilities. Failure to acknowledge the right to have service animals. I didn't think we would still be dealing with service animal issues. Now we are. Service animals are different, folks. I get it. I hope you do too. Because a number of our cases are service animal issues. Communications about what is or is not acceptable. And then public access mobility. If the sidewalks, which are public, are not done, I can't get into the complex, which may be accessible. And we're seeing that in certain places. Nice new pristine, accessible places, but I can't walk with my 3-pronged or my 4-pronged cane because the sidewalks are all a problem, or other things. So we need to do that. Well, recommendations for this had to do with the UN and ratifying the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. They wanted to expand the THRC's authority to investigate and settle claims involving reasonable accommodation. We have reasonable accommodation in housing. We don't have it in employment. So we are looking to expand. We had a law, it's gone to summer study on the employment side, so we'll see what that means. It also was general subbed, and for some people who know the legislature, that means they just kicked it to the curb. So we'll have to see what happens on that. Enhance education access for students with intellectual disabilities and limit segregations from non-disabled students, consistent with the 2004 reauthorizations of individuals with disabilities. Then there's the homeless issue. The mayor mentioned it. Homeless and near homeless populations. Criminalization of indigent and unhoused persons and crimes against the homeless. This is an interesting group. In cities, south, you see them, but you see them all over the country. I've been in cities. You see them even in Chicago. They just live in various places in Chicago. Usually it's underground or it's in places where they can stay warm since the weather is very difficult. In Nashville, however, the weather is not that bad unless they put the white flags out. So you see homeless people everywhere. My office used to be at 6th and Church, and it was the park that the homeless lived in exclusively until they redid it. And they kicked them all out. Well, guess what? They're back. Because they redid the park, and it's a lovely park, but because what? It's something they know. They also go in and out of the library. We consistently see issues of homeless persons who get kicked out of the library more than any other group. And by the way, these are some interesting people, and I've talked with them who know a lot because they're in the library reading, and they know their rights, and they sue everybody, including us sometimes, because we don't move as fast as we should. And the reality is that people do stigmatize the homeless and do terrible things to them. And they are sometimes arrested simply because they are homeless. It is a problem. So the question is, how do we do it? And then on top of that is another issue, and that is sometimes they have needs that we don't recognize or acknowledge in terms of their special needs and those kind of things. So we always have to do that. At one point, it was thought that more than half, or right at half, were veterans. So the question is, how well do we treat those who protect us from the issues of the world? Recommendations was really to develop a collaborative plan that focuses on preventing homelessness and then look at transitional services, access to permanent housing, employment, and health care. In Nashville-Davidson County or in Metro, it is very difficult to find affordable housing for those who work every day. So it's even more difficult to find housing for people who are homeless or near homeless. And then there's the people who work every day who don't have a permanent place to live, and they live in rooms or rooming houses, and they're not called that, but they're there, and people do that. But there's just not enough for people to live in, so that's one thing. One was to urge the Tennessee legislature to adopt the Compassionate Assistance and Right to Exist Act. This was introduced last year. It was not introduced. It was introduced for 2 sessions. It did not pass. They wanted the Tennessee Human Rights Commission, the individuals doing this, and I do happen to know them, to actually take over enforcing this particular issue. What we had to say was we had limited resources, and to do it, we'd need other people. Well, unfortunately, that does kill a bill. And I hated to do that, but there was no way we could take on and it is a large responsibility statewide to do that. So at some point, we are looking for ways and talking about what does that mean and what does that look like. And who should enforce it? Should it be us or should it be someone else? There were a number of things. What we noticed was the mayors of the 3 largest cities, 3 largest cities. We had Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville, all testified about what they were doing with respect to immigrant populations and how they were dealing with housing issues. So again, it came up in those issues. Well, our report is long and lengthy. I'm not going to bore you with more statistics. It is 214 pages. but it is broken down by topics and subject matters. And the housing issues are showing up in every last one of them, though. One thing I will say that there was in the general piece, and this gets me back to affirmatively furthering, they looked at the whole landscape of community and said community needed to be looked at in a global perspective. How did one issue affect another? Was there employment in the area? Was there transportation for people to get to jobs? Was there housing close to jobs? And those were some things presented by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, along with their perspectives on education, and the Columbia Law School group, who talked about state and local governments and their role really in enforcing the treaties that the U.S. has with the UN and other nations, and how we could use that to do that. Well, like I said, we have right now 5 full-time positions in our housing unit. We have 3 staff people and 3 collateral duty. We're hiring 2 more. Our housing office is located in Knoxville, Tennessee. It amazes me that sometimes we're able to do a lot with a little. And don't go tell anybody I said that, please. But at one point, I just want to share with you the kinds of things that our staff is doing. We close on average about 115 cases every year. We conciliate cases. We're usually in the 40 to 50 range. We have obtained since 2008, about $550,000 in benefits. These are actual dollars to actual persons who have alleged discrimination. These are settlements with the exception of a couple of one hearing, and the hearing was in Chattanooga. And the hearing involved an Asian couple who went to rent an apartment, and the landlord, they didn't go because they didn't speak English. A friend went to see if the apartment was available. It was the Liu family, and by the way, I can call their name because it was a public hearing, so don't tell anybody I violated confidentiality. The Liu family spoke limited English, so they sent a friend to ask about that, and the person said, the landlord said, you're Asian. Is this couple Asian? He said, yes. They said, they stir fry, don't they? So he says, we eat a lot of food that's stir-fried. And he says, I'm not going to rent to them. You know, that stir-frying stuff smells up the whole house. They're terrible residents. I can't get it cleaned out when they finish. Well, that was what they said to the person who went to try to rent the apartment for the couple. When we got the complaint from the family, and by the way, the person, we have, this is what I call the snitch rule at HUD. Under the HUD Fair Housing Act and under our act, if you tell us, you then become a party and you can get relief from it as well. So we had the couple and we had the individual who went on behalf of the couple to attempt to lease the apartment. And so they told our investigator. Were you the investigator? No, okay, Richard was the investigator. They told the investigator. They said yes. We told him. Now Richard's African. He has an accent. It's not heavy, but he's an African accent. And the guy says, they just stir fry, and it just creates all this problem. So he told us everything we needed to know. We caused the case. We took it to hearing because the landlord wouldn't settle. Even after all that, we said, but you violate. We don't care. We're going. And so they went. I believe he was an attorney. Is this the one who is the attorney? Yeah, he was an attorney. So he thought he was right. He said, it's my property. I can do what I want to. We went to hearing, and our commissioners looked at it and decided that after we found, and by the way, the administrative law judge said, yes, it is a violation, and awarded the couple and the individual money. The individual who told us about it and who reported it initially wanted more money than we gave them, so he sued us. And that's sort of an interesting kind of a piece. And there's always twists and turns. We didn't take it personally. We understood. And our commissioners looked at that as a separate issue because he literally did take us to court and did sue us. And so we looked at it and we said, no, we're not giving you any more money for telling us about this. We think it's appropriate. The family themselves were able to find housing within about 3 weeks. And when we gave them their money, I believe we ended up with about $15,000 to the couple because they were only out of housing for about 3 weeks. And they were still in a house. They were just looking for another extra 3 weeks. And then we had punitive damages on top of that. For the 5th straight year, our staff has been able to meet the HUD performance goals of closing 50% of our cases in 100 days or less. And that continues to be a challenge for us now with 3 people, but we've been able to do that. We're close to 50% this year. We may or may not make it. So we're going to see what that means. And then we're able to work with partners such as you and to do a variety of things and to work on education and other things. We're seeing issues in familial status cases. We see those on an ongoing basis. Reasonable accommodations based on disability continues to be the second largest number of cases we see. Every once in a while, coupled with race, it is the largest. We have refusal to rent and discriminatory statements based on race, similar to the Liu case. We have failure to provide reasonable accommodations based on disability. And every once in a while, the biggest thing we get is we get letters to the complaining parties that eliminates the fact that they didn't pay rent. So we're able to make them whole. Because if you have bad rent, bad credit, you can't get other housing. So we've been able to move that back. Well, I'm going to close at this point to remind you that we're always working to move things forward. We're always working to look at issues and to deal with that. And we're always trying to look for and find partners to work with. At some point, this is a partnership. It is not us and them. It is all of us working, as Fred would say, for the betterment of our communities, for fair housing, and for other things. As Dr. King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. I hope this matters to you. We can't be silent. We must continue to work together. We must continue to work to identify issues, and we must promote that opportunity for everyone in every community is right, not just in housing, but in every aspect of their lives. I leave you where I started. I believe this is what Fred Cloud would want me to say today and want me to leave you with. I believe we must continue to forge partnerships, to forge issues, and we must not put our heads in the sand, because affirmatively furthering fair housing is going to require us to look at ourselves and to determine if the emperor and empress have on clothes. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly, for all the work that you and the commission do. And here is a token of our appreciation. I'll find the one with your name on it here in just a minute. If not, we'll there we go.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you so much for such great remarks.